Think about it for a second, right? When you're just scrolling through your phone, how often are you bumping into these like huge American tech companies?
Constantly, right.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much unavoidable at this point. They're everywhere.
It really highlights their global reach. I mean, they've become such a dominant force, and that inevitably leads to some pretty tricky questions, particularly about international taxation.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, this White House memo that's taking a really strong stance on this whole issue. Specifically, how digital services taxes and other regulations are being applied to these American tech giants overseas.
So what we're going to do is we're going to dig into this memo, but go a little deeper than just reporting the content right.
Absolutely.
What are the core arguments here? What's the reasoning behind the U.S. government's position? Then we can kind of zoom out a little bit and think about some alternative perspectives and, what are the implications for international trade and the digital economy, which is, increasingly global.
Yeah, it's a huge topic with a lot of moving parts.
We've got a bunch of sources we're going to pull from, the White House memo itself, of course. Then some analysis that supports the memo's position and arguments from the other side, those who disagree. And we've even got some news coverage so we can get kind of the full picture.
So for this deep dive today, our mission is this: to understand the U.S. government's position on these foreign taxes and regulations. What are they so worried about? And what can this all mean for the average person listening? Someone who uses these digital services and is impacted by these international economic policies every day.
Yeah. It's all about making sense of this complex issue, breaking it down in a way that's clear and avoiding all the technical jargon and really getting to the core principles.
Okay, so let's start with the U.S. perspective then. The memo really emphasizes how big the U.S. digital economy is. And it's these big tech companies that are really driving it. They actually make some pretty interesting comparisons to highlight just how big this sector is.
Yeah, that's one of the first things you notice, right? This emphasis on scale. They point out that the U.S. digital economy, GDP, is actually larger than the entire economies of some pretty significant countries like Australia or Canada or, even most EU countries.
Yeah, that really puts it into perspective.
It definitely does. And that context is crucial for understanding why the U.S. government is so intent on protecting this sector. It's a major economic force, and they want to make sure it stays that way. It makes you think about how this level of economic power translates into leverage in international negotiations, right?
For sure. And building on that, the core concern they raise is this trend of foreign governments basically reaching beyond their borders, exerting what they call extraterritorial authority to target American companies and in particular tech companies. And the U.S. argues that this isn't just bad for these companies, but that it's basically grabbing revenue that should be going to the U.S.
That gets to a really interesting tension between national sovereignty and the global nature of these digital businesses, right? The U.S. sees these moves by foreign governments as a direct challenge to its economic interests, to its ability to tax its own companies.
Yeah.
It makes you ask, where do you draw the line between a country's right to tax economic activity happening within its borders and another country's right to protect its companies that are operating internationally?
Yeah, and they don't just speak in these general terms. The memo lays out specific examples of what they see as problematic actions by these foreign governments.
Right.
The first one, and probably the biggest one, is digital services taxes, or DSTs.
You hear a lot about those.
Right. These started appearing around 2019, and the U.S. government estimates that they could cost American companies billions of dollars. And what really seems to bother the U.S. is that they claim some foreign officials have openly said that these taxes are meant to plunder American companies.
Yeah, that's pretty strong language, and
It
that's
is.
plunder. They specifically name France, Austria, Italy, Spain, Turkey, and the UK as having these DSTs that are under scrutiny. And using a word like plunder suggests that the U.S. sees this as deliberate and unfair, that it's not really about legitimate revenue raising, but more like just taking American profits. So it really makes you think, how would those governments imposing these taxes see it differently? What's their rationale?
Yeah, it's a pretty stark contrast in how they're framing this. And it goes beyond taxes, too. The memo also raises concerns about digital services regulations that they see as being more restrictive or burdensome for American companies compared to domestic companies in those countries. So it's like the argument that the playing field isn't level.
Yeah, they're suggesting that these regulations aren't really about fair competition or protecting consumers, but that they're actually meant to give an advantage to local companies. And that raises questions about protectionism.
It does. And then they go on to list a whole bunch of other measures that they're worried about. Things like limits on cross-border data flows, which are obviously really important for these tech companies, requirements that American streaming services have to fund local productions, which, directly adds to their costs,
Right.
and even network usage and internet termination fees. It starts to feel like there's this concerted effort to really pile on costs and restrictions.
Yeah, if you kind of zoom out and think about the big picture, the U.S. is saying all of this together. The DSTs, the regulations, the fees, it all infringes on American sovereignty. It could lead to American jobs moving overseas. It hurts the global competitiveness of these U.S. companies. And of course, it makes their costs go up. And then there's this underlying concern about sensitive data being under the control of foreign regulators. It's a multi-pronged argument for sure.
And so in response, the memo lays out the U.S. policy.
Yeah.
They're going to take action against what they see as discriminatory and disproportionate burdens meant to shift money or intellectual property away from American companies. And when they say action, they mean things like imposing tariffs and other responsive measures to counter what they see as harm.
So what's the bar for taking action? What are they going to look at to decide when to actually do something?
Well, the memo lays out some specific factors.
Uh-huh.
They'll be looking at taxes that seem to be designed to single out or disadvantage U.S. companies, regulations that could hurt their growth or, their current business models, any actions by foreign governments that might force a U.S. company to give up its intellectual property,
Right.
and generally any measures that seem to be making it harder for U.S. companies to compete globally. It suggests they're keeping a pretty wide scope open for potential intervention.
It does. It definitely sets up a framework for how they're going to identify what they see as unfair practices and how they justify taking action, which raises an interesting question. What does that framework say about the assumptions they're making about the fairness of the existing international economic order?
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so we have a pretty clear picture of the U.S. perspective and the thinking behind it. But who within the U.S. government is actually responsible for dealing with this? And what might they do? The memo gets into the specific roles of a few different agencies, starting with the USTR.
Right. The USTR is definitely the main player here. They have the power to decide whether to renew those Section 301 investigations into the DSTs of, France, Austria, Italy, Spain, Turkey, and the UK, the countries we talked about before.
Yeah.
And the key point is what happens if they do renew these investigations. The memo says that the USTR is going to pursue all appropriate and feasible action in response. That's a pretty strong statement. Section 301 of the U.S. trade law basically gives the president a lot of leeway to respond to unfair trade practices.
Yeah, it sounds like it could open the door for more tariffs.
It could.
And it's not just about the countries already being investigated. The USTR is also supposed to look at DSTs in other countries that might be discriminating against U.S. companies or hurting U.S. commerce. They specifically mention Canada's DST and even bring up the possibility of using the USMCA to address it.
So they're basically saying we're not just concerned about what's already happening. We're watching out for any new digital taxes around the world that we think are unfair, and bringing Canada into it through the USMCA adds another layer because that's a formal trade agreement between the countries.
Right, and it's not all just top-down government action either.
Right.
The memo also mentions that the USTR is going to set up a way for American businesses to report any foreign tax or regulatory practices that they think are harmful. It sounds like a way to get more information directly from the companies.
It is. It's about being proactive and getting input directly from the companies that are being affected by these foreign policies. That data they collect could be really important in guiding the USTR's investigations and, shaping future policy.
Okay, so it's not just the USTR that's involved. The memo also says that the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of Commerce, and the USTR are going to work together on this.
Yeah, they all have this joint responsibility to identify any trade practices or regulations by other countries that they see as discriminatory and that are hurting U.S. companies, both in the digital economy and, more broadly. And the important point is that they're also supposed to recommend actions to counter those practices. So it's a coordinated approach across different agencies.
And the Secretary of the Treasury has some specific tasks too, right?
Yeah.
The one that really stood out to me was they're supposed to investigate whether any actions by the EU or the UK are requiring or incentivizing U.S. companies to use or develop their products or services in ways that could undermine things like free speech or political engagement, or even how they moderate content. So this goes beyond just the economic side of things.
It does. Now it's about how these foreign regulations might actually impact fundamental rights and even how these American tech platforms operate and what content they allow. So it makes you think about the intersection between economic policy and these really basic rights.
Absolutely. And the Secretary of the Treasury is also tasked with investigating whether any foreign country is subjecting U.S. citizens or companies to discriminatory or extraterritorial taxes, or if they have tax measures that hurt U.S. competitiveness or go against existing tax treaties. And this ties back to what we were talking about earlier with the possibility of doubling taxes under Section 891 of Title 26.
Right. And that's a really interesting point. It directly references what we know was happening in the previous administration with that reported executive order to investigate these kinds of taxes. Section 891 is a pretty obscure part of the U.S. tax code that lets them dramatically increase tax rates as retaliation. And the fact that they mention it specifically here really shows how serious they are about these potential financial countermeasures.
Yeah, it's definitely a signal. Okay, and the last thing on agency responsibilities is this. The USTR is also supposed to figure out what tools the U.S. can use to try and get a permanent global agreement to not impose customs duties on electronic transmissions. So it's about shaping trade policy for the future of the digital economy.
Exactly. As the digital economy keeps growing, avoiding tariffs on data flows is going to be crucial for maintaining open trade in the digital realm. It's really a forward-looking goal.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good handle on the U.S. perspective and what they might do. But as you can imagine, not everyone agrees with this view. What are some of the counter-arguments against how the U.S. sees digital taxation?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Many countries argue that DSTs aren't about unfairly targeting American companies at all. They see them as a necessary way to make sure that these big multinational tech companies are paying their fair share of taxes in the countries where they're making significant revenue. Because those traditional tax frameworks that often rely on physical presence, they argue that those are just outdated. They don't work for these digital business models.
Yeah, that makes sense. If a company can offer services and make a ton of money in a country without actually having much of a physical presence there, the old way of taxing them might not capture that economic activity very well.
Exactly. A lot of people who support DSTs say they're a response to this issue of BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting. It's basically about multinational companies using loopholes and mismatches in tax rules to shift their profits to places with low or no taxes.
Right. I've also heard the argument that DSTs are often seen as temporary measures. What's the thinking behind that?
A lot of countries see DSTs as a stopgap. They're putting them in place because it's taking so long to get a global agreement on how to tax the digital economy. The idea is that these temporary taxes will bring in some revenue in the meantime and also kind of keep the pressure on to reach a more comprehensive international agreement, maybe through the OECD or the G20.
So it's like saying we need to do something now, but we're still working towards a more permanent global solution.
That's right. Another big argument is that DSTs help to level the playing field between traditional businesses, the brick and mortar stores and these huge digital companies. Traditional businesses have a big physical presence and they're subject to all kinds of taxes. But digital companies can operate with a much smaller footprint. So DSTs are seen as a way to make sure that everyone is contributing to public services and infrastructure in the countries where they operate.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the U.S.'s threats to retaliate with things like tariffs, that's causing a lot of concern internationally, isn't it?
Definitely. A lot of critics are worried that these U.S. actions could lead to a big escalation of trade tensions. You could see this back and forth of tariffs between countries, which is bad for everyone. It hurts businesses. It raises prices for consumers. It strains relationships between allies. It just injects a lot of instability into the global trading system.
And some people even argue that DSTs shouldn't even be classified as income taxes. They say they should be seen as consumption taxes, which would align more with international tax principles.
That's an important point. If DSTs are seen as taxes on the consumption of digital services within a country, not as a direct tax on a company's income, it could change the whole legal and diplomatic landscape. It could challenge the U.S. claim that these taxes are clearly targeted at American income.
So we have this fundamental disagreement, right?
We do.
The U.S. sees these taxes and regulations as unfair attacks, while other countries see them as essential for updating their tax systems and ensuring fairness in the digital age. It really shows that we don't have a unified global approach.
And that lack of consensus is a huge challenge. We could end up with this fragmented global tax system where every country is doing things differently, which just leads to more complexity and disputes. We also have viewpoints from sources like that Guardian editorial. and they're pretty critical of the U.S.
Yeah, they don't seem to have a lot of sympathy for the U.S. position. They seem to think that the U.S. has been blocking progress in the OECD's efforts to reform international tax rules. Like the U.S. is trying to control the process and then not supporting the outcome.
That's their argument.
And they suggest maybe a UN tax convention is the way forward, one that lets countries tax based on where the economic activity is actually happening. They even talk about moving away from the arm's length principle and towards a system of unitary taxation. That sounds like a really big change.
It would be a major shift. Unitary taxation basically means treating a multinational corporation as a single entity for tax purposes. So profits would be allocated to different countries based on things like sales, employment, or assets in those countries, which is very different from how things work now, where you try to figure out the profits of separate subsidiaries using these complex transfer pricing rules.
And The Guardian seems to think that the world might have to move forward with a UN convention, even if the U.S. doesn't want to participate.
Yeah, they're basically saying that the U.S. position is holding everyone back, and that maybe the UN needs to step in to create a global tax system that isn't dominated by one country's interests. They even point to past examples where international agreements have happened without the U.S.
So the U.S. is talking about tariffs and maybe doubling taxes.
Right.
It really feels like things could escalate into a trade war.
There's definitely a real risk of retaliation from both sides, and that could be bad news for everyone. It shows how delicate this whole situation is.
So what are some possible ways forward? We've got all this disagreement and these potential actions hanging over everything.
Well, one obvious path is to really push for multilateral negotiations. The OECD and the G20 are still the main places where countries can try to hammer out a global agreement on digital taxation. And that UN tax convention idea could be another option or maybe a way to work alongside the OECD. The key is to get people talking again and find some compromises.
And it seems like any real solution is going to require some big changes to international tax rules to really address the digital economy. We can't just keep relying on physical presence.
Exactly. Whether it's moving towards unitary taxation or coming up with some other innovative approaches, the system has to change to reflect how businesses actually work in the digital world. We need to rethink some pretty fundamental ideas.
And it seems likely that DSTs are going to stay a point of contention for a while.
Probably.
Some countries see them as a necessary temporary fix.
Yeah, and if that's the case, maybe finding a way to frame them that way, as steps towards a bigger solution rather than as a tax, could help calm things down a bit. Focusing on diplomacy rather than retaliation would be a good idea.
Definitely. And more transparency and cooperation when it comes to sharing tax information internationally seems important.
Absolutely. It builds trust and helps fight tax avoidance. And as we've talked about how these DSTs are classified legally, whether they're seen as consumption taxes or income taxes, could have a big impact on how they're treated under international law and existing treaties.
Okay, so let's talk about tariffs for a minute. The U.S. is saying this is a tool they might use. What's the thinking behind using tariffs, and what are the potential consequences? Stuff that you, the listener, should know about.
Well, from the U.S. perspective, tariffs are about applying economic pressure. The idea is that if you make it more expensive for foreign governments to do things like impose DSTs or put in place regulations that the U.S. sees as unfair, it'll deter them from doing it in the first place. It's about protecting American economic interests by using leverage to influence policy in other countries.
But what could happen if the U.S. actually uses tariffs? What would that mean for people?
The biggest risk is that things escalate. It's very likely that the countries the U.S. targets with tariffs would retaliate with their own tariffs on American goods. Then you have a trade war where businesses face higher costs because of the tariffs, and those costs often get passed on to consumers as higher prices. So think about the things you buy. Tariffs can disrupt those supply chains and lead to shortages or delays. On top of that, these trade disputes can hurt diplomatic relationships, which makes it harder to cooperate on other global issues. And there's no guarantee that tariffs will actually work in getting the U.S. what it wants.
And then there's the other tool we've talked about, the possibility of doubling taxes under Section 891. Why would the U.S. even consider something so drastic?
It's about direct financial retaliation. If the U.S. thinks a foreign country is unfairly taxing American companies, they could respond by hitting citizens and companies from that country with much higher taxes in the U.S. It's meant to be a really strong signal that they're willing to get tough to protect their interests.
But that sounds like it could backfire pretty badly.
It could. The most obvious risk is that those foreign countries just retaliate and double taxes on American citizens and companies in their countries. And then you have this situation where investment and economic activity are hurt on both sides. Plus, it creates a really messy and complicated situation that could lead to lawsuits. It also undermines those international tax agreements we've talked about and makes the U.S. look protectionist and unfair. It could do real damage to international cooperation in the long run.
So both tariffs and doubling taxes, they might give the U.S. some leverage in the short term, but they also come with a lot of risks.
Exactly. They might feel powerful in the moment, but the long-term consequences for international trade and the global economy could be really negative. It shows how important it is to think carefully and understand all the potential ripple effects.
So we've talked a lot about the USTR, and their role is crucial, especially when it comes to investigating these digital services taxes.
They're definitely at the center of this whole thing. The White House memo lays out their responsibilities pretty clearly.
Right.
First, they have to decide whether to renew those Section 301 investigations into DSTs in those specific countries. And second, they have to decide whether to start new Section 301 investigations into DSTs in other countries, including Canada.
And these investigations aren't just a formality. They can have real consequences, right?
Absolutely. If the USTR decides that these DSTs are discriminatory or hurting U.S. commerce, they can recommend actions like tariffs. So there's a direct link between these investigations and what actually happens in the global economy.
And the USTR is also going to be the point of contact for American businesses to report those foreign tax practices that they think are problematic. So they're gathering information to make their case.
Yeah, they're setting up a formal way for businesses to share their experiences and concerns so the USTR can build a case for taking action. It's about making sure that the company's perspectives are part of the process.
Okay, so big picture. The U.S. government is taking a strong stance against foreign DSTs and regulations, seeing them as obstacles to American economic interests. And they're seriously considering retaliation, like tariffs and maybe even doubling taxes.
Yeah, they're trying to protect the U.S. digital economy and assert their sovereignty against what they see as a foreign overreach.
But at the same time, many other countries argue that these DSTs are a necessary update to their tax systems in the digital age, and they see them as a temporary solution until there's a global agreement. And they're worried that the U.S. is going to start a trade war.
It's all about different perspectives on what's fair and anxieties about how U.S. actions could escalate things and make international cooperation on tax policy harder.
And it seems like we're at a crossroads. It's really hard to get everyone to agree on how to tax these big tech companies, which means we could end up with a messy patchwork of different tax rules around the world and more trade disputes between countries.
Yeah, the disagreements about basic principles like fairness and national sovereignty and the best way forward make the whole situation pretty volatile.
So stepping back from all this, what does it all mean for the future of global trade? How is this going to affect power dynamics when it comes to taxes? And how do we balance national economic interests with the need for international cooperation in this increasingly digital world?
It forces us to ask some big questions about how the global economy is going to be governed in the 21st century. Can countries go it alone and protect their own interests? Or do we need a more collaborative approach to create stability and a fairer system?
So here's something to think about as we wrap things up. Could all this tension around DSTs actually lead to something good? Could it force us to create a global tax system that's more just and sustainable in the long run? Or are we headed for more division and conflict as countries struggle with these issues? It's a question with a lot of layers, and the answer will have a big impact on the future of the global economy.